Welcome to Navigating the Future of Retail. Please join me in welcoming Steve Dennis. Steve is the founder and president of Sageberry Consulting and the host of the award-winning Remarkable Retail podcast. After nearly 20 years in senior leadership roles at two Fortune 500 retailers, he launched his own consulting firm, quickly becoming one of the world's top retail influencers. He's also the author of two best-selling books, Remarkable Retail and Leaders Leap, where he stresses the need for retailers to become truly remarkable and organizations to transform at the speed of disruption. Today, Steve will share key moves that every retailer needs to know to successfully navigate the future. Our host is Greg Arthur, VP of Retail Strategy at OneBeat. Welcome. What a great opportunity to hear the two of you together. Thanks everyone for
Thanks.
joining.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Happy to be able to talk to somebody with a background like yours, Steve. It's going to be, I think, a fun little bit here. So Karen already went through kind of the introduction, but if you wanted to, let's start off. Maybe you can walk us through your background, how your thinking on retail has changed, and what led you to write the two best-selling books.
Sure. Well, I'll try to keep it brief, but I have been at this a long time. I've spent most of my career in retail. I worked for a large consulting firm when I first got out of business school. I spent a little bit of time in CPG, but I started in retail at Sears Roebuck and Company way back in the early 90s. And as was mentioned, I rose up through the ranks at Sears, and then I joined the Neiman Marcus Group as head of strategy and multi-channel integration and a bunch of other things. And then I went off on my own. I guess it's been more than 15 years ago now, doing consulting that eventually led to writing and speaking and launching um, podcast about 5 years ago. I guess, the couple things I like to highlight. One is I've worked across pretty much every merchandising category, hard lines, soft lines. I've worked in every kind of format, started working in e-commerce, 1997, 1998, outlet store business, luxury, mass merch. So for better or worse, I've got this very wide range of experiences and really been working on multi-channel integration and in innovation and digital disruption for more than 20 years. As far as, I guess, what I've seen, at the risk of stating the obvious, retail has been really changed, you know, for 30 years now, where if you go back to the mid 90s, almost all retail was involved with going to a physical store. Now, today, obviously, e-commerce is 20-25% of all transactions. Digital influences actually more in-store. This is maybe something we'll get to, but as much as we talk about digital influence, websites influence more in-store traffic than actually e-commerce transactions. So this blurring of the lines between digital and physical have been something that I've been really focused on for a long time. But both my books really, maybe we'll get into it a bit more detail. But Remarkable Retail, which came out about 5 years ago, was really my attempt to kind of distill down what key trends I saw develop really in this century and what retailers should do about it. And the real premise of that book is it's no longer good enough to just be a little bit better than the competition. You really have to become truly remarkable. And then Leaders Leap, which came out last year, really tried to answer the question fundamentally, if the world has changed so much, why have so many companies changed so little? Because it's not news to anybody that retail has changed a lot. Most people, I think, would say things are changing at an ever increasing rate. And yet, so many retailers have changed very little. So I wanted to try to dive into that and hopefully a unique perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I spent a long time in retail, and the most recent CEO that I worked under, um, I was told more than once by that gentleman that he could do my job on a legal pad and paper. So it's interesting to hear about the like you say, with the emergence of a lot of kind of advanced technology, it's interesting to see retailers who are still not taking advantage of it, losing that competitive
Mhm.
advantage. All right, so
Yeah.
you've been around for kind of, through it all. What do you feel like kind of characterizes the current retail environment?
Well, there's several things, and some of these we could probably talk about for hours. I mean, the one probably most obvious is just a high level of volatility and uncertainty. Some of that, and I definitely cover this in both my books, some of that has been with us for many, many years. I mean, not only is technology changing very rapidly, and you could argue changing at a more exponential than linear rate, so that's a challenge. We see a lot of shifts in consumer behavior. There's a lot of macroeconomic forces that have been at play and are sometimes hard to understand. The United States in particular, we've got all this tariff turmoil, so it's very hard to talk about retail without talking about the impact of that. So maybe we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But I guess a couple of things I think have been pretty pervasive for the last several years and probably are getting more pronounced. One is what I coined about a decade ago, retail's great bifurcation, which is you see a lot of success at the lower end, more value, price, convenience oriented side of the equation, and a fair amount of success on the more higher end specialty side of the equation. But this middle ground has been contracting, and I would argue collapsing in many cases for quite some time. And I think we're seeing more evidence that that is accelerating for a bunch of reasons. The other thing, which is related to that, is what I've started to call the great concentration, which is, and this is much more, I think, of a US phenomenon. So I'd be interested, maybe some of the people in the chat, because I know we have at least a couple of people from the UK, because I saw a few folks that I know. But, uh, in the US, if you look at incremental growth, more than for the last couple of years, more than 50% of all the incremental growth is accounted for by just three retailers, Amazon, Walmart, and Costco. And you get to about 65% of all the incremental growth if you just add several more retailers, TJX, Shein, Temu, and a handful of others. So if you think about that, and you think about a few small companies that are growing very quickly, Warby Parker, On, Viore, what's happening to the vast majority of all retailers? The answer is no growth or negative growth. And when you put that up against the margin pressures that are accelerating, particularly because of tariffs, but also labor shortages and things like that, the squeeze on just anybody that's not one of 10 or 20 retailers is quite significant. And so a lot of times we tend to talk about the consumer or retail in general, but that's not what we experience, right? It's not very interesting to say the consumer's doing pretty fine if you serve the lower quartile of consumers who are really, really struggling and it's about to get a lot worse.
Mhm.
So so I think we have to really accept kind of the reality, get into those challenges, and then dig very deep as to what it means for you in your particular sector or your particular competitive situation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The statistics on that concentration and the number of companies that are really growing is kind of interesting. I definitely, it's interesting because there's with the kind of accessibility or what has until now been a lot of accessibility to production markets for smaller retailers.
Mhm.
One of the things we've also seen, or that I've seen, I'm curious about your thoughts on it, are that it's hard to you either really do have to be an everything store or you have to be very focused on
Right,
one or two things. Um, and so it kind of crowds out, like you said, that middle. That it used to be you'd have specialty retailers who kind of dominated the mall space, your, Abercrombies and things like that.
right,
Um, and now it's like you have to be, if you want to do that, you either have to have a very strong brand or you have to be the best at a lot of different things because someone is going to come along and say, we're just making, companies like Mott and Bow, we're just going to make jeans and we're going to target a specific
right.
demographic. How have you seen, a kind of, I guess, a scattering of that demand into some of those? You mentioned Warby Parker,
Mhm.
some of those kind of individual brands.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back, not to do too much of a history lesson, but we talked about obviously the retail world was dominated by physical retail if we go back 20 or 30 years ago. But the other thing that was true was this aggregation of demand and actually being a little bit of everything to everybody was a pretty successful strategy. Most of the famous retailers, where I started my career in mass department stores, Sears, when I joined, was the second biggest retailer in the world. The biggest retailer was Walmart. And then you had an era of category killers, Bed Bath and Beyond, Office Depot, Circuit City, right? Where it was a little narrower, right? But you still were trying to be a little bit of everything to everybody. And you went to a physical place for the most part to see it, everything. Well, in a world where the internet exists and where it's possible to develop pretty successful businesses just by going very narrow, being a little bit of everything to everybody ends up being really nothing to anybody. And so that's why I say the middle has been collapsing. And you really look at where, maybe we'll talk about this, but his whole retail apocalypse narrative is demonstrably false at the high level, because since the retail apocalypse narrative developed, physical retail has continued to grow. Now, e-commerce is growing much faster, and e-commerce and physical actually should work together for the most part. But where you see most of the bankruptcies and most of the store closings, it's these retailers that were stuck in what I call the mediocre middle. And so it's just largely an untenable strategy to do that. So there's this fork in the road, at the risk of being really cliche. Some of my keynotes, I used to have this little fork in the road thing, and I sometimes was embarrassed to show it because it seems so obvious. But retailers have a choice between being remarkable or irrelevant in general, but they also have to decide in this bifurcated world, are you going to go to the side of price, convenience, value, super frictionless, all that kind of stuff? In which case, you're largely coming up against the Amazons and the Walmarts and the Costcos in the world. So good luck with that, trying to out Amazon or Walmart. And so that's really not a choice for 99% of the retailers in the world. The choice is how to become more special. And in many cases, that's particularly difficult because you usually have to narrow your aim in terms of the customers you go after. So, for example, if you look at the department stores today, trying to become a better department store, you know, good luck. It's contracting world. So the question is not, how do I keep this very, very wide customer base and try to be a little bit better? Because you're just fighting against all the market share that's either going kind of upstream or going downstream. The question is, how do you narrow your aim and become really special and deep and more relevant to probably a smaller set of customers? And obviously, when we look at brands like Viore or Warby Parker or Sephora, I mean, you can list a lot of names. They understand their customer very well, and then they go really deep and kind of amplify the wow for those customers, not try to cast this
Mhm.
really wide net and do a bunch of things incrementally better. That is a waste of time. It's just, the problem is when just to use the department store as the example, when you've got all these categories you're in and all these stores, you're trying to figure out how to leverage the assets you have. And the answer is 20 years ago, you should have started to make a major pivot. So that's not very helpful advice for people that have watched the last 20 years happen to them. But for other folks that perhaps aren't so constrained or have more latitude to do things, it's to start to make that shift. And in most cases, it's that at the fork in the road, you're probably needing to turn right rather than left.
Yeah, yeah, it's the old the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is
Yes,
today.
right.
Um, that's interesting. So what does it kind of look like in your view when a company does make that shift from being reactive to kind of taking control of their own future?
Well, I think there are a few things. One, and I talk about this a lot in Leaders Leap, where I really get more into, I mean, there's plenty of strategy points in that book,
Mhm.
but a lot of it is really more about leadership qualities and for lack of a better term, courageous leadership. And some of that is just getting really honest with yourself and with your situation. Because what I see, I mean, I saw this when I was at Sears, I saw this maybe to a lesser degree at Neiman Marcus, because when I left Neiman Marcus, the business was performing extremely well, but you could definitely see some issues on the horizon. It's just be really honest about what is going on with your customers. Like if you, I mean, I hesitate to say this, though I'm still shocked at how few companies do this. But if you don't understand for your current customers and the customers you desire to grow, how you're doing with acquisition, how you're doing with conversion, how you're doing with cross-sell and upsell, how you're doing with retention, how you're doing with whatever, however you want to measure remarkability, NPS scores. Like, if you don't understand that really well and you don't understand the why behind it, it's very difficult to know what to focus on. But I can tell you, I see many retailers that don't even do a basic level. And so I think in some cases it's denial. And so you have to break through the denial. In some cases, retailers are so focused on just the day to day, and it's understandable, the pressures that everybody's dealing with to run the business day to day. But if you're not able to step back and open the aperture and really see your situation quite clearly, but the other thing is, and I can say this from my firsthand experience, both as an operating executive, but also as an advisor, chances are what got you here is not going to get you there. In other words, um, in fact, what I often argue is what made you successful in the past is not likely to serve you terribly well in the future, but it actually might get in the way of what you need to do to succeed. So again, I'll use the department store example because I think that's pretty familiar to everybody. It was really clear 20 years ago, 25 years ago, frankly, through the work we were doing at Sears, that there was no scenario in which department stores were not going to continue to decline. I mean, in fact, I have things and also some work I did at Neiman Marcus in terms of the future of luxury. It was very clear, if you were willing to really look at it, that there were structural issues that were going to prevent the growth and profitability of those sectors. So then the question is, well, do you want to try to be a better version of a failing business model, or do you want to find sort of Earth 2 where you're going to move to? Now, that's a
Yeah.
difficult, I don't want to be trite about it because that is a huge, huge issue when you've got all your assets tied up in one area. But you have to be willing to do it. So the answer really is to start to experiment around the edges. If you have a failing business model, you need to find a more workable business model. Now, you're not going to go, like, the answer for Macy's, for example, is not to come up with some totally new concept and then in 3 years build that out. First of all, that wouldn't be practical. You
Yeah,
can never finance it.
I think
So
JCPenney tried that 10
right.
years ago. It didn't go great.
Yeah, so it's not easy to do, but I think the first step really is to get very clear on what you need to do and then start to develop these parallel paths to move your business over a period of time. And everybody's situation is going to be way different, but a lot of that is really doing the work, being willing to open the aperture, being willing to let go of things that no longer serve you. It sounds more like a spiritual kind of thing, but but I do some executive coaching, and a lot of times it's much more about the fear that keeps executives stuck and organizations and cultures stuck. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's probably a longer answer than you wanted.
No, that's great. So that's an excellent strategic framing. So one of the things we talk about a lot here at One Beat with retailers is, we find that a lot of them still think about things like inventory as this kind of static problem, even
Yeah.
though, as you said, everything, all of the demand patterns are changing and there's all kinds of, things going on in people's lives that are affecting their behavior. So, as retailers try to be more adaptive and they try to adjust to the realities of the market, what do you think gets overlooked in that shift?
Well, I think one thing, though, I think most retailers are appreciating this is, there were a lot of things that were very fixed in operating models, and a lot of, as it relates to inventory, supply chains that were relatively fixed. And I think we learned in COVID that that wasn't always such a good idea, and the tariff situation. So I think we have to really think about agility as really kind of a superpower that most organizations need to have. Now, there's certain, if you're building a store or whatever, at a certain point you have to decide that's what we're doing, and you can't keep all possibilities totally flexible. But I think agility, a much more agile operating model, is much, much more important. You also, I think, have to really, I was talking about really understanding customers very deeply. The other thing you have to understand is where the leverage is in your business model. And in some cases, I mean, it's really nice in some respects to have a largely digital business model because that gives you a much more ability to respond much more quickly. If you've got a big store fleet I mean, I fundamentally, maybe it's another topic we want to get into, but as much as I am have been pushing back against the retail apocalypse narrative, there is no question that there is too much physical space in most Western markets. If I walk into most stores, not all, but walk into most stores and ask yourself the question, if you had to do it all over again, how big would the space be? In the case of department stores, every department store I've been in the last 5 years is at least a third bigger than it needs to be for the future. Um, so that's, independent of how many stores, locations you need. So it's a very difficult, issue to deal with that, or how you happen to have laid out your distribution fulfillment model, than it is how to make specific buying decisions, what product lines to carry, and all those kinds of things. So I think we have to be moving to more agility. And then as it relates to bigger long-term investments, or dealing with, really kind of the albatross around a lot of retailers' neck in terms of some of the physical space, those are really different kinds of questions. So, it's complicated. I don't want to make it sound like, it's very easy for me to make these pronouncements and say, "Oh, just go do that." But the reality of it is you have to think very carefully about where to place your short and long-term bets. But I think the main thing is really think about, almost start with a blank sheet, think about where you'd ideally like to be in, say, 5 to 7 years' time, and then start to work back with how can you deal with some of those investments. But more of it is probably about what experiments do you want to be doing, because you have to work your way through. It's just too hard to predict. If you go back 3 years ago or so, what was the main topic at conferences? The metaverse.
Mhm.
I haven't been to a conference in the last 2 years when anybody talks about the metaverse. People are talking about agentic AI. 2 years ago, nobody was talking about agentic AI. Now, it remains to be seen how fast this will all play out. But I think any of us have been around for a while know sometimes it sound really like I worked on projects about how to leverage Second Life and MySpace at one point in my life, right? That turned out to be a total waste of time, right? So it's very hard to predict exactly what's going to be important. But if we build the agility, we have a clear view of where we think we want to end up, it's a little easier to decide what to do in the shorter term.
Gotcha. That's interesting. Yeah. So as people, as a retailer starts to move and kind of enact their strategy, what are some of the blind spots you think that kind of hold people back? Like, what do you think deserves more attention than people are likely to give it?
Well, I'll give you my more strategic answer, and I'll give you my sort of more leadership, spiritual sort of answer. I think what holds people back is often too narrow a view of their competitive environment. I'll give you an example. When I was at Neiman Marcus, we were not particularly worried about our vendors' own stores. So we were where, Louis Vuitton and Gucci and some others have had their own stores for ages. But for the most part, we saw that as really kind of a flagship strategy. They're going to have a small number of stores. And actually, if they opened in the same mall we were in, we thought that was just good because that was going to make that mall more of a magnet. Well, flash forward, Louis Vuitton has over 1,000 of their stores in the United States. Just about every mall, any kind of upscale mall, has many of these vendor stores. The North Park Mall, which is just a couple miles from where I live here in Dallas, when I was at Neiman Marcus, there were about 3 vendor stores. Now there are 30 to 40. And so you have to be willing to go through these scenarios and try to understand. Now, to me, it was fairly obvious that vendors were going to invest more in their own stores because it was going to allow them to have a direct relationship with their customer. But because at the time they were slow to adopt e-commerce, it was easy to say, well, they don't seem to be too serious about it. But if you understand consumer behavior and how it's shifting, and you understand the underlying economics, you can start to work out at least some reasonable hypotheses about what might happen in the future and start to work into. So I think you have to open the aperture, you have to brainstorm, you have to say, well, what are some of the biases I have in my head that keep me from seeing things? The more kind of spiritual leadership sort of answer is really trying to understand what you're afraid of. I could tell you where at Sears and at Neiman Marcus and at several of the clients I've worked with, what often holds leadership back is they're actually quite afraid to get things wrong. When you decide to make a shift in your strategy, there's a chance you're going to be wrong, right? And you may get fired, you may not get, and like all the reasons why we're fearful, just you might look stupid. And so the more you understand what you're really afraid of, perhaps you can start to work through it. And in most cases, what that's going to mean, aside from, what that mean for you as a leader and how you should show up, is, well, can I start to do some small things to defend against that? So for example, and I don't know that this would have worked, but as more traffic was moving off the mall, if you understood, say, again, use the department store example, 25 years ago, not again to get into too much of a history lesson, but most of the cosmetics business in North America was done in department stores. Today, most of the cosmetics business is done at Ulta and Sephora. The value and share shift away from department stores is massive. And Ulta, which is a publicly traded company, and not to make it all about stock market value, but Ulta only selling 10% of what a department store sells is worth more in the stock market than Macy's, Kohl's, Dillard's, Nordstrom, Neiman Marcus, and Saks combined.
That's
So in
crazy.
20
Sure.
years, you've had this massive volume. So there are any number of things along the way that those department stores could have done. Acquired Ulta, opened up their own form. There's any number of things. But again, you don't have to figure this all out in one fell swoop. But if you see where the world is moving and your goal is to grow with your core customer, you've got to be experimenting with things. But usually it's like, well, we'll just keep being a better, we'll sort of defend the status quo and try to make that better rather than find bolder things you could do, but not, Hail Mary kind of thing. Because the problem is when you're a struggling retail, you end up to the point where most of your options are gone. And so you definitely don't want to make that happen. So for folks that are struggling to grow their top lines, struggling to improve their profitability, what are you afraid to try, and maybe go try it?
Interesting. So you mentioned agentic AI. In terms of some of these things that people might try to kind of transform their business models, are there any that you think are either overhyped or any that you think are potentially being overlooked?
Well, I do think agentic I mean, most of these things are overhyped. Jason Goldberg, many listeners probably know, a friend of mine, brilliant guy. Uh, he often says most things that we get excited about are overhyped in the short term, but underhyped in the long term. And, I guess you can't say that about everything, but uh, if something really has the fundamental ability to change the basis of competition, then you better spend some time on it, and that'll vary. And agentic AI, for example, um, has the ability to bypass major distribution channels. If you can go get if you're trying to put an outfit together and you can go directly to the agent can help you go directly to the manufacturer or maybe find some small niche retailer and you can put that all together, that really puts at issue the role of the intermediaries, which are largely multi-line retailers, right? So that may not happen, or it may happen. I can't tell you, is that going to be significant in 2 years or significant in 10? Like I've been wrong about the pace at which, and on both sides, the pace at which some innovations may happen. And but the key there is to get really smart about it and to start and maybe listen to different voices outside of your company. That's not a pitch for consultants necessarily. It could be just paying more attention to what's out in the literature. But it's building that culture of experimentation, and then realize that in many cases you're just making a decision for the next 3 or 6 months, right? And then you'll know you'll be that much smarter, and then you can decide: do I step on the gas? Do I pivot? Do I go, it turns out like this isn't something for us and we can drop it, or we can come back to it in 6 or 12 months. But if you aren't spending enough time, and I can tell you, working with retail leaders, working with a company right now, they are not spending nearly enough time on the future. And I understand it because their business is tough and they're affected by tariffs, and they're dealing with a lot. Um, but you need to be able to find time to really open the aperture and explore some of these areas, and make a more intentional decision as opposed to let things happen to you. So go back into your question about being reactive versus proactive.
Mhm.
every retailer needs to have an R&D budget. It may be 1% of their sales, it might be 5% of their sales or whatever. But if you're not allocating resources, both cash and people, and the right level of people to really, to have a process to sort through the effects, whether it's agentic AI or retail media network, there's always going to be some, I don't even know what the issue is going to be. I mean, you go back to the Chinese factory direct model. Again, that was, at least, in the US, that was not something anybody was paying any attention to 3 or 4 years ago. And even though Temu and Shein are being, their business is really pulling back in the US because of the tariffs. But those businesses, $30 billion or something, from almost nothing in a
Mhm.
few years. So it's very difficult to know what is going to be significant in a few years' time. So you just have to build the agility, you have to build the culture of experimentation, and you have to be sure that you're investing enough time, energy, and brain power to make sense of this. And it's only getting harder to make sense of it than not.
Excellent. So I'll get one more question and then we can, I think, go to the Q&A, since people have been pretty active in the chat. Um, so I guess one question is you literally kind of wrote the book on leadership. Um,
A
and
book, unbelievable.
a book, but a very good one. What do
Thank
you
you.
feel like, in this environment, what do you feel like leaders have to either unlearn or relearn to succeed in the next chapter? You talked about the R&D budget, you talked about some
Yeah.
of these other things, but from a leadership perspective, what do you feel like a successful leader in retail is going to look like over the next 5, 10 years?
Well, I think a big shift from at least the way I was taught and had a certain amount of success is, it kind of relates to being very humble and vulnerable. I think most retail cultures historically have tended to be, I mean, aside from just being, more white male dominated, they tended to be very top down. Like if you're the leader, you kind of have all the answers. And yeah, I joke around that, like Liam Neeson says, I have a very particular set of skills. I think there were certain skills that were highly valued for a long period of time. Most retail leaders came up through merchandising or store operations, and that's fine. I'm not saying that's not useful, but when you have this digitally driven world, when you have, so many different, actually, I'll mention another thing Jason Goldberg talks about. Most of retail, when you think about product discovery or brand discovery, was discovered in a physical store for a long, long period of time. That's the way we learned about brands, you know, if- that were new, or maybe we moved to a life stage where you're interested in that appliance or whatever, and you go to the store, you are very driven by mass advertising, right? Well, the world is very, very different. Discovered on TikTok is now a very big thing for everybody, but particularly for younger generations. So if you have come up in one way of being successful, you really have to think about a very different way of being successful. So I think that's about being humble. That's about listening to more and different voices. And that is about getting much more comfortable with risk and this agility thing we've talked about. So I think it's a very different way of leading. And when I talk to some people in the executive search world, that's a lot of what they're really struggling to find leaders that have both the kind of resume skills of, oh, I did, product development, e-commerce, whatever it might be, but also those that can operate in this much faster world, this much different world, and a place where what influences what customers do come from so many different places now. Social media is being, kind of the most obvious, but that's certainly not the only thing that's important.
Awesome. Thank you. It's a very, very good answer. We are getting done. I want to make sure that we can get to the Q&A. So Karen, if you could get some of those questions for us so we can get Steve's thoughts on them.
Yes, let's do it. So we have a few questions here. Where do you see the biggest potential or payback for AI in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think in the short term, so maybe even less than 3 years, I think most of the payback in AI is going to be more efficiency driven. rather than say effectiveness, just to kind of be black and white about it. It's automating um, more manual type processes, which can have a significant effect on employment. I think we're already, I think, seeing a ton of, at least with some of the people that I talk to or work with, seeing a lot in marketing automation. So that can be being able to do way more personalized communications than, I mean, obviously that's been something that we've been moving to for quite some time. This idea of a one-to-one future, I think, is made much more realistic by leveraging AI. Um, Obviously, a lot of we're already seeing plenty of imagery work that instead of having to shoot with models, actually just doing that through AI. So I think speeding up and creating more iterations in marketing, already seeing a ton of that. And I can't even imagine where that's going to be in 18 months' time. Over the long term, agentic AI, I think, is really that could really be a paradigm shift in how search in particular works, as well as how which retailers from a distribution perspective end up winning.
Steve, I can't wait to see where this is going. Like, just everything is changing so fast. Another question we have here is, how do you scale innovation across an organization without creating resistance?
Very carefully, that's my answer. Um, it, I mean, it's a huge challenge. I think one of the, not to undermine my book, but one of the hardest things when I was writing Leaders Leap was to try to really address this head on. And I think it's complicated. Well, first of all, it's complicated organizationally in a lot of cases. If you think about the way retail has evolved, particularly over the past decade, where customers don't care about channels. So I'll get a little silent here, but and I'll come back to the heart of your question. But most retailers still are organized in a fairly siloed way. So if you're trying to do innovation on the customer experience, and we know that customers go back and forth from digital and physical channels all the time, mobile devices are the connecting point between e-commerce transactions and physical stores in a lot of cases. So if organizationally you're structured in a way that's quite siloed, it's especially difficult. So you have to bust those silos, I would say, in most cases, if you're going to innovate on the customer experience. So depending on where you are organizationally, I think I would give you a different answer. If you, um, largely dealt with that, I think you have to understand what the pockets of resistance are about. This defense of the status quo, the innovator's dilemma, if people have ever read that book, it's very powerful, and it's more of a cultural thing than it is maybe an organizational thing. So I don't think it's easy at all. I think the best you can, or not the best, but one of the things you can do is the more you're making the case for change very clearly and people understand it, the more you understand the barriers to change, which in many cases can be the way people are compensated and rewarded. So if you look at a culture like Amazon, which really celebrates innovation and rewards failure, to organizations that basically punish failure, um, that alone is going to create a glacial pace of change. So I think you've got to really dissect for your own organization how much of this is organizational, how much of this is cultural, how much of this is education, how much of this is compensation. So that'll vary for every organization.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank Steve. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Greg. This was really incredible. And just feels like there's so much that we want to talk about, and we'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Great talk.
Thanks.